Thank you very much, John. Secretary Domingo, and other excellencies of the Cabinet, present, past, and future. Excellencies of the Diplomatic Corps, honored guests, ladies and gentlemen. Well, thank you so much for the honor of inviting me to give this talk this morning. I had just returned from the United States late last week after a 1-month vacation with grandchildren. I openly admit that, you know, there are benefits to being a senior citizen. So I hope the jet lag isn't too apparent during the presentation. The first thing I'd like to clarify is that I did not craft the title of my talk. That was a companion to the overall theme of the meeting today, which is moving twice as fast. I realize where Secretary Domingo is coming from. Having been in the cabinet myself, we followed what I'd call the duck principle. Of course, part of it means that if somebody's throwing brickbats at you, you better duck. The other is, while you're swimming on the water, the top part of the duck looks as placid as possible. And that's how you should appear, so that you don't get everybody else all excited. But the bottom part of the duck is paddling furiously to get where it's supposed to go. Because there's always need to keep working, and there is always room for improvement. So it is in that context that I think the subject matter today is absolutely appropriate, and I'll try not to make a mess of it. I don't know if the slide presentation is already there, because John didn't have his, and if the boss doesn't have his, I don't know what happens to the rest of us. But if it is, fine. If it's not, it's okay. I'm not really a great fan of PowerPoint presentations. I prefer you look at me and listen to me. I have 20 minutes, I think, although John said 30. So start clocking now. The rest of what I just said should not be part of it. Many of us, myself included, were fired up with a lot of optimism when we started 2011. Carried over to the year was the euphoria of the 2010 elections, reinforced with the battle cries of the administration's matuwid na daan, the anti-wangwang pronouncement, and its rallying mantra, kung walang korap, walang mahirap. With it came a sustained image of an upbeat Philippines, ready once more to link potential to reality and proceed beyond resilience, which is our favorite word, to determination, and to show its true worth in spite of the pervading uncertainties and challenges in the local and global economic arenas. The government's full-year growth forecast for 2011 was from 4.5 to 5.5%, with an aspirational target of 7% to 8% under its inclusive growth outlined in the Philippine Development Plan 2011 to 2016. The economy, however, failed to live up to expectations, to put it delicately, drawing a falling straight-line graph and final posting with a rather dismal 3.2%, especially at the end of the third quarter, disconcertingly lower than the government's revised 2011 target of at least 4.5%, and which some more creative pundits alluded to as an unfortunate representation of one form of matuwid na daan, because it was a straight line falling, even with a 72 billion peso fiscal stimulus program launched last October to perk things up. So far, I haven't seen yet what kind of a dent that package has done, because the final growth rate numbers are not out. But suffice it to say that in comparison to our ASEAN neighbors, relatively higher growth rates were posted during the same period by Indonesia at 6.5%, 6.1% for Vietnam and Singapore, 6% for Malaysia, 4% for Thailand, who similarly had to contend with severe floods since the end of the third quarter through the fourth quarter. As I said, we still don't have the growth rates that are final. But the poor growth rates posted during the first three quarters put us in the category of one of the weakest performers in the region last year. On the bright side, if you can really call it that, it would be quite hard to duplicate the bad growth rates of 2011. So, at this point, there is really nowhere to go but up. The administration will have to work very hard to do worse. And from all indications, it doesn't intend to. How did we get ourselves in this situation? Though government identified external influences like the faltering economy in the US and Japan and the prolonged debt crisis in the Eurozone, as well as destructive typhoons that caused losses and damage in the local agriculture sector as significant contributory factors to the country's poor economic performance, there were a good number of financial institutions, economists, and even administration allies who openly pointed to the government's massive underspending, especially in infrastructure, as a primary culprit for our less than stellar performance last year. The government itself has acknowledged this situation, since it was clear that actual government expenditure for the first 11 months of 2011, net of interest payments, amounted to 1.4 trillion, or 365 billion short of the programmed 1.7 trillion expenditure for the year. Government started with the private sector as the main engine of growth, so the public-private partnership, or the PPP, was the central vehicle the administration was banking on to push the economy. Introduced as the administration's flagship infrastructure initiative, the PPP got off to a rather tenuous start and seemed to continue on a sputtering mode even before it was able to take off, with only one completed bid last year, despite the original plan to roll out 5 or 6 big-ticket infrastructure projects within 2011 to spur economic activity and create more jobs. This, together with the anemic government spending, were the main things that have impinged on the government's capability to push the economy more vigorously, considering the high ratings of the president's popularity. But whether the administration was either overcautious or, as some of its harsher critics would say, simply beyond its element to execute its projects, we continue to view the situation with optimism. Obviously, if the president is popular, he must be doing something right. And what we need to do is to help him capitalize on this and have a firmer connect between his popularity and moving the economy so that the whole ship of state moves forward with speed. The last thing we need is a Hobson's choice, as it were, of a continuing history, economic history, of having unpopular presidents with reasonable economic performance and popular presidents with anemic ones. It is reassuring to hear the president himself recently declaring there would not be a repeat of last year's underspending, and officials consequently announcing the planned bidding of 16 major projects under the PPP. Together with agriculture, the president expects infrastructure development and tourism to be the lead growth drivers in 2012, which he hopes, and I quote, will insulate us from whatever happens overseas, unquote. We are similarly glad to note that some major pillars of the economy remain strong. Some indicators being that remittances remain high in spite of the fact that people thought that with all the global difficulties, remittances would have taken a nosedive. Foreign reserves are at an all-time high, and inflation has been kept at bay and has been contained in a band which is both acceptable and manageable. Still, it is quite obvious at this point that the Philippines needs further reforms to address structural bottlenecks in the economy. Thus, I would say the theme that it may be growing too slow and moving too fast is not so much a criticism, but a reflection of an anxiety that we have so much potential, and we're pretty good at talking about that potential, but we have to do a lot more to walk the talk. These reforms would include measures to raise revenue to support higher spending on infrastructure, health, education, and social protection, as well as simplifying business regulations to encourage investment, entrepreneurship, and job creation, part of which will be dealt with in more detail by Bill Luz. Arangkada, of course, has itself provided many key recommendations. John just went through them in quite detail. And we, of course, are in agreement with this, particularly on those 7 sectors that are mentioned and targeted as the leading sectors of focus. The question is, in relation to your theme of moving twice as fast, will we move twice as fast this year? I'm happy to hear that some forecasters think we will do so in 2050. But by that time, I will only be 100 or so years old. And I may not be as sprightly to benefit from that reality. Though dark clouds continue to loom in the global economic horizon and will affect the country and our neighbors, there is nevertheless some optimism with regards to the Philippine economy. Since the Eurozone is already in an apparent recession, and with China, Japan, and the USA all facing a challenging growth outlook, demand for Philippine exports, unfortunately, is expected to fall, and the Philippines will need to lean on domestic spending to manage a good growth in 2011. It looks as if exports are expected to drop by 9% in the first quarter, perhaps 7% in the second, before inching up in the third quarter. Exports might contract by about 7% this year from a forecast of a 7% decline last year. Not entirely our fault, but there is the reality. And with local businesses and consumers shackled by the global downturn, the economy's expansion may largely depend on government outlays. Again, going back to the idea, there was underspending, we got to have more spending. Making the General Appropriations Act of 2012, signed into law last December 15, pretty much the central economic growth formula for the year. Again, this is assuming the GAA's 1.8 trillion peso budget would be spent as programmed, as has been assured by the Budget Secretary. In the 2012 budget, almost 440 billion pesos would go to infrastructure, agriculture, tourism, and other economy-boosting projects. Among the big-ticket items are about 40 billion for the cash transfer program, 22 billion as strategic support for PPPs, 3 billion for major governance projects, particularly ICT types, 25 billion for the construction and rehabilitation of irrigation systems, and about 12 billion for flood control projects. Presumably then, the national budget will be instrumental in attaining the following strategic goals laid out in the PDP. Economic growth of 7 to 8% for at least 6 years. Second, growth that generates mass employment. Secretary Domingo said about 1 million a year. And 3, growth that reduces poverty, including the achievement of Millennium Development Goals. Adding to our optimistic outlook is the Citibank report, among others, which cites the Philippines as a fertile ground for crossover border merger and acquisition deals. Prospective investors are particularly attracted to our growing population and continued strength of consumers as a driver of the economy, coupled with the country's resilient consumer market, which continued to be supported by overseas remittances and business outsourcing revenues. Assuming that all goes smoothly according to plans, and if we take the lowest actual growth rate of about 3.2% of 2011 and multiply it by 2 so that it grows twice as fast, this would bring us to the level of about 6.4% minimum growth for 2012 in order to reflect an economy that has moved twice as fast. Given the most optimistic of circumstances, we need to ask ourselves, is this a realistic growth rate we can achieve this year? Moreover, is moving twice as fast enough, given the circumstances surrounding our local economy? Unfortunately, the answer to both may not be a very firm positive one. It may have to be cautiously optimistic, to put it nicely, negative, to put it possibly more realistically. The government's growth rate projection, although I had only now heard of Secretary Domingo's own bullish one, for 2012 is about 5 to 6%. But many other institutions, both multilateral and private, show a consensus of lower growth rates than that for 2012. In fact, just yesterday, there was a piece of news that the IMF had just lowered the growth projections not only for ASEAN, but for the Philippines as well. The conclusion then, it would seem, is that we can move twice as fast, but not this year. This would be the year for firmly laying the foundations for moving the economy twice as fast in the coming years, with a combination of continuing reasonable levels of popularity of the president, taking to heart lessons from the previous year, taking corrective measures in key areas, and 4, focusing on the task of building on the strengths of the Philippines. I'm optimistic for the president's popularity to continue, given the fresh air introduced by determined measures of anti-corruption, even as I also hope that the government will not be unduly distracted from its economic task by the inevitably continuing political battles now and to come. As to lessons learned, certainly, the move to much higher spending levels is itself an admission of the need to drastically shift gears. The continuing central problems to address are infrastructure, infrastructure, and infrastructure. I know that the Secretary said that he's gone to many countries around the area, and he's happy to note that we're as good as they are. With all due respect, when I land at the airport of the Philippines, it gives me an immediate, if not accurate, totally idea of where our infrastructure lies. So a more vigorous approach to our infrastructure problem via whatever combinations of PPP and ODA the government could muster, plus the government's own stepped-up spending would be needed. Bear in mind the gestation period for significant infrastructure projects is a minimum of 2.5 years between identification and start of construction. And I'm not saying that in theory, because I was in the cabinet. And when I moved on to the private sector, I actually tried to push an infrastructure project, which I thought was a no-brainer. It has taken more than 10 years, and we're still waiting for it to get moving. If I were to be optimistic about 2.5 years, it's just part of the nature of the beast. You know, I worked at the World Bank for several years, and we had an insider joke there that getting a loan from the World Bank was like giving birth, because there was this process of identification, feasibility, pre-feasibility, feasibility, pre-appraisal, appraisal, loan documentation, blah, 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 before you get to board approval and finally coming up with a loan release, all of which was a minimum of 9 months. So we used to say that as far as World Bank projects goes, it's like pregnancy. No matter how much effort you put into it and how many men you put into the job, the result will only be forthcoming in 9 months. Now you have to identify the project, you have to figure out whether there are right-of-way problems, you have to muster the financial package, you have to go for architecture and engineering design contracts, you have to try to marry these things together, you have to shop around for whichever financial package combination is the best and whichever supply packages are the best. This cannot happen overnight. And therefore, when we say 2.5 years, there is clearly no time to waste. And I'm only talking about the normal stuff. I'm not even saying here the other things which have to do with environmental clearance and the need for everybody to say yes to a project before you can dig a hole in the ground. Now, this level of spending will, however, need financial resources, which brings us to fiscal strategy. While I laud the Department of Finance's commitment to tax compliance, rather than new taxes to raise funds, it would, I believe, still eventually need a balanced approach between effective tax administration and measures to expand the tax base to really pull this off. It may sooner rather than later also need new tax measures and incentives rationalization. But can it be done? Of course. Possibly cannot this year, but I'm much more optimistic that this is possible within the lifetime of the administration in the coming years, given the proper environment. Beyond the key areas that I have just mentioned, the starting point for any country to move purposely forward is to have a clear vision of what is its niche in the regional and global economy. Singapore set out to do this early on, and way back then, they defined themselves as an international port, and that's what they set out to do. And then from there, progress on to be a financial center. China defined itself as the world's manufacturing juggernaut, and they used their resources to move along those lines. Japan early on defined itself as an export-oriented, technology-centered economy, and so forth and so on. I can go on. What is our definition of ourselves? We have to be more precise about what are our strengths and how we can capitalize on that. So you look around and you think, what are our strengths? Definitely, many are telling us that our key strength in this particular region has to be based on human resources, and which is why a lot of people would emphasize the service sectors as among those things that the Philippines can really be competitive in. Therefore, we have to do everything we can in order to continue our upward trajectory in the BPOs and the IT sectors of the new economy. But even there, we have to move from being sophisticated telephone operators towards being able to produce software ourselves and to go into such higher levels of technical sophistication, such as exemplified by graphics arts. I don't need to go into a discussion of tourism, because there will be one later, but certainly that is a service sector that we could capitalize on, and tourism is not definitely promoted simply by telling the people that this is a country with beautiful scenery and friendly people. Believe it or not, beautiful scenery is pretty subjective. Again, during my years in the World Bank, one of the countries that was my area of responsibility was the Yemen Arab Republic. And I could see tourists standing in stark deserts, miles and miles of sand behind them, taking pictures and saying, "What beautiful scenery." So, don't count on that. It has to do with international marketing. It has to do with hubbing. If we are not part of the international tourism packaging, then it's much more difficult for us to be a tourist center. And I also realize that there are discussions going on now with respect to the common carriers tax, and this may yet be another example of taking a choice of generating income in the short term or looking at an expanded tax base by an expansion of tourism, and thereby also possibly coming up with a multiple of the revenues that one is to expect. I think the 7 areas chosen by Arangkada, Philippines are precisely spot on. Mining, definitely, in the manufacturing area is a very important resource. But we have to do something more in terms of, in particular, number 1, of the relationship between the national government and the local governments with respect to the jurisdiction and proper application of laws with respect to mining. And if we can get beyond that, or simultaneously as we try to get beyond that, we should think in terms, and I think we already are anyway, but let's emphasize it, of moving mining away from just extraction towards a much more sophisticated level of actually manufacturing the goods right here in the Philippines. I know some mining industries which, while making a lot of money, would benefit a lot from just being a relatively high level of income gravel and sand operation. You got a bunch of trucks, you shovel the dirt, you load it on the trucks go to the port, they put it on a ship, and off it goes. That may look like mining, but it's not the kind of mining that's going to drive us forward in terms of creating jobs and having what has been repeated time and time again as inclusive growth. Arangkada identified agriculture. Not a surprise. Agriculture has been identified to me since I was 6 years old. Every year I'd hear people speaking about how we are a predominantly agricultural country, blah, 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 blah. And still we are more or less here glorifying rural scenery of carabaos and people deep in mud planting rice. That won't do it. We have to be able to move agriculture towards higher productivity and move it from there towards agro-industry. And that may require a review of our land reform law. All of these things will require a number of other reform measures that have to be focused upon. From the infrastructure side, it does not help any that we have the highest level of energy costs in the entire place. That definitely has to be watched very carefully. All of this would, of course, need a good education system. Who couldn't dispute that? But in the education field, we seem to be partially stuck in a mantra of thinking that because we have X number of people that have to go into the educational system each year, we have to have a classroom for every 30 of them. I don't know of any country in the world that tries to put a classroom beside every barangay in their area. The problem with that is that you can't match it with the number of qualified teachers that you need to put in those schools. And so you have actually a more major gap in our education system of teachers rather, aside from classrooms. We need to address this. And I think perhaps one has to review the idea of the use of school buses and the funding of school buses to be able to bring students to fewer school buildings with more competent teachers in a more efficient way of delivering education and probably a much lower cost. I could go on, but there's a lovely lady in front of me with a sign that says 2 minutes. So, in the last point I would make here, let me summarize. I'm optimistic. You bet we can move twice as fast. Not this year, in spite of Secretary Domingo's fearless forecast, but this year is a good year to get it moving. You know, an administration may have 6 years of theoretical lifespan, but you know, the first year is a learning year, the last year is a political year, and so I hope we're not finding ourselves running out of time. So the faster we move, the better it is for us. At the end, of course, whether you call it 7 sectors or whatever it is that you're targeting, the whole thing has to do with making sure we are expanding the middle class of our society, providing jobs, providing employment, and reducing poverty, as that is really the end game of any society. Because at the end of it, it's useless for us to say, are we trying to be like Singapore? Are we trying to be like Japan? Because the answer is really no, they are different personalities. And as the tourism people like to put it, even if we're going to be richer, we should still be having much more fun. So with that in mind, I thank you once again for inviting me. I hope that was interesting enough. And I'm looking forward to the many sessions in the rest of the day that I'm sure would prove very useful to all who are gathered here today and in the rest of the country. Thank you very much.